The alternate universe that you have to postulate then is much more agrarian universe.
Okay.
It totally negates the inventions made and discoveries and just going around between 1860 and 1910 or 1907. So it's just not this world. In this world, Bakelite or something like this would be invented at roughly that time. If it hadn't been invented, if you hadn't been invented,
experiment.
Yeah, you see, it's only a part of a spectrum. You have to take not only Bakeland and everything that comes with it, you would also have to take out the discovery of commercial household electricity.
Right.
You would have to take out the formation of people moving to cities. So as part of that entire spectrum, you would have to have technology come to a standstill.
We would really have very mediocre or very poor braking type system. They would be wooden instead of the type of brakes that we have now.
If you went to my house, what you would find is copper electrical wiring with a little bit of paper and some cloth around it, but only in spots, because in most places it's bare insulation, free bare insulation right now, and ready to blow up. I have a 1928 house. By 1928, plastics had still not been developed enough to go and in the line of insulation. That would come for polyethylene about 10 years later.
Well, they're using Bakelite insulation in radios, though, right?
Yes.
And high voltage situation.
But for things like wire, they used rubber things. Rubber. If you want to say, it would be a totally different
That's
world.
what I'm asking.
Okay?
And I wanted
in a different world, what would that be like?
Yeah.
We would still have wood.
Right, but you're saying it would be probably go back to an agrarian, much more of an agrarian society. No automobiles would stall out in a lot of ways because
there would be no automobiles.
They just wouldn't work well.
Because you wouldn't have rubber tires either.
Right.
If you take away the Bakelite, then you take away rubber tires.
Okay, and radio wouldn't develop, electricity wouldn't develop.
Radio could develop, I would think. I don't see why radio wouldn't be. It would be a nice Gothic carved wooden containers.
That's true, wouldn't it?
And with wooden or iron knobs.
Right.
That's the other point. Much of what, some of the things we did with Bakelite and later plastics could have been done through metals too, at much, much heavier weight, and much higher cost.
If you go back into the 1900s, they used a lot of porcelain.
Right.
Your light switches were porcelain.
So what's wrong with porcelain? I don't need Bakelite.
It was hard to work with it. It was fragile. You couldn't. I guess you could make all the shapes you could make, mold it, or these things with it.
Was it as good an insulator or not as big?
Probably
about as good.
Right?
Good Same dielectric. Okay.
Now they had cars. They had distributor caps made out of cellulose, or do they make them out of on the Model A's and stuff? They had porcelain insulators.
Yeah.
They made, the Bakelite was used for distributor caps later on. My son brought home an old desk telephone. The telephone had the shell of the telephone was thin cast iron. It was cast.
Wow, yeah.
And so was the receiver.
Right.
And inside, you opened it up. They had what they called the material. It's called Ryertex. It was like built up in layers of fabric and some kind of resin on it. And they drilled it and they used that for insulators or to mount stuff on, like circuits if you had to make it insulated. It was called like a Ryertex.
Somehow there would have been other materials developed for specific applications that you've mentioned.
Cars would go great, no problem. Airplanes.
They'd have to do some work to get them to have the right properties. So this was a very unique material, and that's why it lasted so many years. But it worked in electrical application, as in the car distributors and things were all Bakelite materials, and somebody would have to develop another product that had the right properties for each of these applications.
One of the early science fiction writers with mystics, Charles Fort, coined the phrase, when it's railroad time, the railroad will be discovered or invented.
Ah, interesting.
Okay.
You're right.
That's the phrase.
So when it's plastic time, plastic will be discovered?
Yeah,
it became plastic time?
Because Bakeland was not the first. Bakeland was not the first one to work on new plastic. God knows how many people were doing.
Yeah, but they all quit.
No, that is not correct. Because cellulosics, for example, what was the first billiard balls?
Billiard balls.
Billiard balls.
Yeah.
But Bakeland made the transition to industrial scale, large scale. Now, he still did it, and this was his downfall, in the 19th century model, namely the proprietor model. He's the boss. He wants his son to take over the company. He wants a line of Bakelands running this place. And
George just wasn't up to it.
I don't even want to say whether George was up to it, but it got to be the wrong model.
Okay.
George Eastman was still doing Kodak at the same time in the same model. But that's when you began to see the transition to the company.
Okay.
Where it's not the owner that runs things, where it's the company.
Okay.
DuPont in the next 20, 30 years would develop the modern industrial lab. And this place here sort of started to go that way, but it's still for the father figure of LHB.
Because it had so many ingredients in that material, you could raise or lower the percentages of different ingredients in it to make it even more suitable for the application that you're going to be putting it into. It fell into so many different categories. It was in the light switches and the wall switches and washing machine agitators and motors, and fit into many different applications, and I think that's where that expression comes from. A lot of things that people don't necessarily see, but it's in there and it's working because of its unique electrical properties, other things that it had that made it unique for those applications.
What we like to do nowadays is draw spider diagrams where we have properties like a star. And Bakelite extended enough on each of the axes to be industrially useful and so much better than everything else, and not having any obvious flaws in terms of what was available before. So nowadays, you don't see that much made of Bakelite because we got materials that have more extensive properties, where Bakelite now looks like a flaw. But compared back then, it just was flawless compared to many other things.
There's nothing to compare it with.
You hear a gigantic chord of music. You're saying, it just gets all over you. And you take one of the notes out. Okay? That's how I see Bakelite. It's not anything really unique. It's the spectrum of things that happened all at once at that time.
Driving a car, you hit the brakes. Phenolic is part of the component that makes the brakes. There's some molded materials in there that are made with phenolic materials. Insulation within this room, I'm sure, is probably fiberglass. The binder that holds fiberglass together is phenolic. If you go down the street and look at a lot of wooden homes, binder that's used to hold the wood components together is phenolic. If you're working with some wood and decide that you want to shave it a bit, use paper, sandpaper. The binder that holds the material, the garnet or the abrasive is phenolic.
Okay.
There's types of laminates that are phenolic based. If you fly on an aircraft, the interior uses phenolic because it has no smoke, no toxicity, or no volatiles being emitted. Unless you want to consider bread.
What?
Unless you want to consider bread.
Oh, I want to consider everything. Why is bread?
Well, you can mold that.
Yeah, you could.
Fabricate it into
clay.
Right.
I would think clay.
Tough.
Metal is molding
decent.
material.
Right. Casting.
Church bells. I don't know many church bells made out of Bakelite.
But you pull these out of the mold.
A lot of energy to go into that. Though.
Right. That's the other thing.
Very big cost.
Yeah. Cheap, inexpensive.
Okay.
Well, mankind had put them together for 4,000 years.
Okay.
They just didn't know what they were doing.
Okay.
If you think of
That's the alchemist?
no, I'm thinking of the Egyptians. Shellac, for example, had been known since we don't even know how early. Dyes, even nanotechnology. The first nanomaterials were already known to the Egyptians.
What was this?
Dyes.
Yeah, different colors.
Where you
And you're saying they're nano because they're just that small? They're component parts?
Nano just means so small that it reflects. That's about the wavelength of light.
Right. Okay. That's the
And when you move fast forward to the second half of the 19th century, industrialization in the United States is happening big time. Robber barons, developments right and left in the various fields. Electricity. Bakeland, for example, before he did phenolphonaldehyde, was dabbling in first photography and then electrolytic cells up in Tonawanda on the Niagara River.
Born with an endurance that ought to make metal ashamed of itself, its limitations remain to be discovered.
Oh, that's good. That is good. Yeah.
You like that?
I like that very much. Yeah.
There are many that are in a lot of automotive applications under the hood that are phenolic gears and pumps and products like that.
There are areas where where metal is still better and still being used, but in terms of versatility, metal should be ashamed of itself. Notice where he came from. He married the daughter of a big shot university professor or head of the department, whatever.
Schwartz.
His wife probably also thought that she was sinking down.
The immigration element really played a role here in terms of coming from nowhere and really striving to.
So what is he striving, in loose term, what is he striving for?
Yeah, what?
First goes to Columbia, but then what does he want to be? He wants to be the head of a company. Right. He doesn't want to be a chair professor.
He doesn't go in and say, look, I'm a professor at Ghent University, I have this title, and I could go back, and I was a doctorate before I was 20 or whatever. He doesn't go into that trip. He says...
So that's America.
Okay.
If he had come from England or were in England, oh my God, you would not want to talk to a person of commerce. And the highest would have been, yes, you're a professor, you hope to be knighted sometime in your life. Over here, you want to make money.
Like a little virus.
Respect in the United States is money.
Well, also in New York City, when you're dealing with the Dutch, forget it. Right? Forget about it. Yeah, right.
So the point is the fertilization, him coming over. And again, you might want to ask chicken or egg, why is he coming over in the first place? Why doesn't he go to Paris?
Here we could sort of cut through a lot of red tape and through our initiative be able to solve a problem. Whereas you're pretty well regimented in a European type atmosphere. That if you work for a university professor, you still have to go through him to be able to do that.
And the university professor would not go to the garage next door and say,
to look at what you got.
I see you got this piece of equipment that you make jam with at high temperature and pressure. Give me one of them.
He wouldn't. It just wouldn't enter his mind to do that.
And it would be no commercialization concept associated with it. It would just be the pure chemistry that would be the fascination that the professor would have in mind.
Right.
And the publication of that.
Right.
That's really the objective of what we're doing in the university.
Right.
Whereas this was the entrepreneurial motivation and developing this to where it be commercial.
The American way was you do not trial and error. You do not, and Edison had already shown the way.
European guys did that.
No.
Regimented.
No.
Okay, talk to me.
The European way was you reason it out. Okay? Reason comes first. Implementation comes afterwards.
This is what I need to hear, guys.
The American approach, where Edison is, of course, the prime example, is we're too stupid. We can't reason it out. But I want the material, I want the money. So if I have 15 ways of putting things together, I try all 15. If I have 150, I try to do all 150. Yes, I use my logic, but the first thing is the experiment. He had the element, which is the entrepreneurship. He was not just a chemist that developed the molecule. He's the guy that by that time had already two big, huge inventions under his belt. Was setting up...
two? Velux and
the electric...
the Townsend, sure.
Okay. He set up one company, if you look at the history, he had set up, by that time, already one company after the other. He was very modern in that respect.
Right. Now, do you think that had to do with Bakeland as a European or Bakeland as a new American?
As a new American, definitely. The European part is the academic part, where later he was very happy to be president of American Chemical Society. That gave him big jollies.
Sure.
But the American part is you set up a company, you sell a company, you make an invention, you make it to make money, not to invent. And you have a customer in mind, and he'd had that with the Velox and with the Bakeland. He, along with God knows how many other people, knew that if we could just develop these materials into a more advantageous way, you could